Thank you guys all for coming out tonight to the Nuclear Millennial Caucus at Purdue University. It is with great pleasure and honor on behalf of the School of Nuclear Engineering to introduce Suzanne Jaworowski. She is a senior advisor for the U.S. Department of Energy for the Office of Nuclear Energy. Suzanne was one of just 20 presidential appointees to serve on the landing team at the Department of Energy. She's now the senior advisor acting as political liaison between Office of Nuclear Energy and the Secretary of Energy and the White House. She is responsible for education and outreach on nuclear issues. Prior to working at the Department of Energy, she led the presidential campaign for the state of Indiana for President Trump. And before working in politics, Suzanne had a successful communication business. I'll give it to you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Good evening. Thank you so much for having us here. I really appreciate your warm hospitality. So glad to be here at Purdue University. Our panel is stacked pretty well representing Boilermakers tonight, I have to say. But before I introduce our esteemed panel, I also want to acknowledge Abi. Abi is here on behalf of Congressman Todd Rokita, and he's going to come and say a hello on behalf of the Congressman. Abi? Right here.
Hello? Hello, my name is Avi Reddy. I'm here with Congressman Todd Rokita. I'm also a Purdue graduate, and standing here in CL50 right now is really surreal. Also, like most of you, I'm anxious over tomorrow night. Hopefully they can figure out something for Haas's elbow, but that's a conversation for a different day. I'm here to pass along the Congressman's regrets for not being able to attend. However, this panel, this topic, is super important to him and our nation. We've seen where our dependence on fossil fuels has gotten us, both geopolitically, environmentally, and a host of other areas. So it is important that we have this discussion. It is important we have great experts and we can push our energy future forward and we diversify. And I think nuclear energy, the Congressman would probably say, is one of the most important parts of that, hopeful future portfolio. So once again, on behalf of the Congressman, he sends his regards. Thank you for being here, and boiler up.
Thank you, Avi. I also want to make another introduction and just, you thought you were going to sneak in there, Tristan Vance, but I want to just acknowledge that one of our state leaders is here in the area of energy, Tristan Vance from the Energy Economic Development. Anything that you want to say, Tristan?
Oh, no, I'm glad you're having this night. I'm excited.
All right, thank you so much. So nuclear technology is very important to our country, and I'm here on behalf of the U.S. Department of Energy, the Office of Nuclear Energy. As Nathan said, I was one of the first people on the landing team with the Department of Energy. We actually came and started working at noon on January 20th, 2017, as President Trump was taking the oath of office. Since then, a lot has happened, and one of the things that has happened that's notable, I think, and I hope for your future, is that the President of the United States and the Vice President, our former Governor Mike Pence, came to the U.S. Department of Energy on June 29th last year, and he had 10 items for the Department of Energy. And among the top 3 was all about nuclear. One was President Trump said, we must revive, revitalize, and expand the United States civil nuclear industry. And that's what we're working on here. One of our challenges is the perception and knowledge about nuclear in our country and abroad, frankly. And so that's where these Millennial Nuclear Caucuses have been born from. The idea is that the Department of Energy wants to be able to share information with factual information so that young people have an opportunity to ask questions in a very non-threatening environment with experts who can answer those questions and make up your minds for yourself about the future of nuclear and how you think the future of nuclear should be shaped and developed and utilized for your world in the future. So I'm really excited tonight because we have a great panel for you. Our panel represents both the existing fleet of nuclear reactors as well as the new design for nuclear reactors, which will be coming to our country and around the world in the next 10 years. And then also representative about policy and how the U.S. policy for energy will help shape and clear the way for that transition to take place. And so I want to introduce our panelists. To my right is Tim Hanley. Tim is a senior vice president from Exelon Generation. Exelon Generation is part of Exelon Corporation. Exelon is a Fortune 100 company, and it does business in 48 of the states in the United States, plus the District of Columbia and Canada. Exelon employs almost 34,000 people just in our country alone. It's a very large company. It is the leading U.S. competitive energy provider with one of the cleanest and lowest cost power generation fleets. Exelon operates the largest fleet of nuclear reactors in the country. So within the United States, Exelon is really the leader in nuclear reactors. They have 23 reactors that are providing clean, zero-emission power generation 24/7. And so Tim Hanley is here with us tonight to talk about that. Thank you. Tim also happens to be a Boilermaker, and he has a son here at Purdue right now, so he's really representing also. Then Carrie Fossen. I hope I said that correctly. Good. Carrie's with us. She's also a Boilermaker, a Purdue alumni, now graduated about 10 years ago, but familiar back at the school here today. She's really representing the advanced reactors and the new designs that are going to be coming down the pike in the next 10 years or so. We're looking for a whole new design on how nuclear will be smaller, more modular, more scalable in the future. And Carrie works for a company called NuScale. NuScale is developing the first of a kind United States small modular reactor. There's a lot of excitement around the country about small modular reactors, and a lot of excitement particularly on Capitol Hill right now. Our lawmakers are very interested in learning more about what small modular reactors will be like, and so you are here with the front lines of small modular reactors. Carrie's title is licensing engineer. That means she works very closely with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on helping move NuScale through the process of certification. In 2013, the Department of Energy chose NuScale from a competitive award program to partner for a cost-sharing program where NuScale would develop the first small modular reactor design to be submitted in an application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. That has indeed taken place, and NuScale right now has actually, out of that partnership, has developed a new safety design that actually eliminates the need for auxiliary power system in their internal electrical systems, which is quite an accomplishment. That really is groundbreaking for the industry, and I'm sure Carrie will talk about that a little more. NuScale's on track to be the first to develop a small modular reactor, and we're looking forward to that around the mid-2020s. So welcome, Carrie. And our final panelist who's here tonight is not a Boilermaker, but he's going to be cheering very hard for the Boilermakers tomorrow night against Texas Tech. That's what I hear. So welcome for me, Jeremy Harrell. He's with ClearPath. Jeremy's the managing director of policy for ClearPath. He's here from Washington, D.C. ClearPath is a Washington think tank that promotes small government, free markets, and American innovation. ClearPath provides leadership and policy recommendations that focus on really boosting energy security and our economy while reducing emissions and bureaucracy. So welcome, Jeremy. First, I'd like to give each panelist just a few moments to talk about what they do in their roles. So Tim, tell us about what you do at Exelon.
Sure. Right now I'm the Senior Vice President of Operations Support, so all of the corporate functions that support the operation of the plants report up through me. Prior to that, I was the Senior Vice President of Operations for 3 of our plants, Dresden, Quad Cities, and actually Fort Calhoun, that we operated for OPPD for a while. The rest of my career was all spent at the plants in operations, maintenance, engineering, training, and ended my career at the plants as Site Vice President at Dresden, and followed that as Site Vice President at Quad Cities. So, being a 1987 grad, I have no memories of this room, but do have a lot of fond memories of Purdue, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow night's game.
Fantastic, thank you. And Carrie, tell us about what you do at NewScale.
So at NewScale, I'm a licensing engineer, and I'm sure most of you have never heard of that. In fact, before I became a licensing engineer several years ago, I had no idea what that role was. Effectively, my job is to license the design. So I work with the regulator to help them understand how our design meets the requirements that they've set forth. And in cases where it doesn't meet the design or the requirements set forth, I help them understand why that's still safe. Prior to coming to NewScale, I worked at a Monticello nuclear generating plant. I was also a licensing engineer there, did similar work, but I also earned my SRO certification while I was there. So not licensed to operate the plant, but an intense training course that taught me the same fundamentals as an operator, and also worked in outages doing actual maintenance type work. So I've had a little bit of a different background at the plant.
Thank you, Carrie. And then finally, Jeremy, tell us about what you do at ClearPath.
Sure. Yeah, so long story short, I'm the political hack in this room. And so on a daily basis, ClearPath is focused on educating policymakers and ultimately shaping public policy to drive the accelerated development of clean energy. And when we talk about clean energy, we talk about a broader swath of technologies that we know are important both for our country's economic security, environmental future, and geopolitical strength. And nuclear is a major pillar of the work that we do at ClearPath. Before I came to ClearPath, I worked on Capitol Hill for nearly a decade. I worked for a senator and 2 House members and focused on energy and transportation policy. And so that kind of background let me come to ClearPath, and we really work with key policymakers in the congressional committees that have jurisdiction over both nuclear regulatory policy, financing, and research and development. And so, yeah, we come at it. We don't have members. We're a think tank, and we just go in and say, our mission is to accelerate the development of nuclear energy, and we just try to push policies that make sense, that ensure that there's a strong nuclear future in this country.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm going to start off with some questions that I have for the panel, but I also would encourage you to be thinking about what you want to ask the panel. We also want to welcome our online audience. We have Facebook Live joining us, and we also have Twitter feed joining us where our hashtag is Nuclear Visionary. So we would also like you to take pictures, tweet questions and comments about this, and when you do it, please use the hashtag Nuclear Visionary. We will have Sean towards the end read any of the questions that get tweeted in or put on the message board on Facebook. So welcome our online audience also. So first, I'm going to ask a question about clean and why and how nuclear is considered clean. Some of the anti-nuclear folks tend to say that nuclear is not a clean energy, but Secretary Perry says, and he's been quoted very often as saying, if you really care about the environment we live in, you have to really embrace clean, reliable nuclear power. So tell us about why nuclear is clean. And Tim, I'll start with you for an answer on that.
Yeah, I think you have to just look at it realistically. About 60% of the carbon-free electricity in the United States is generated by nuclear power plants. And statistically, just a couple of smaller examples or more empirical examples. They shut down Kewaunee Station, a small nuclear plant in Wisconsin. That increased the carbon dioxide emissions in that state by 15%, just shutting down that one nuclear power plant. When they shut down the San Onofre plants in California, added 9 million tons more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere the next year due to the fact that they weren't running San Onofre anymore. So, we're certainly not opposed to other renewable energies, wind, solar, but they can't be the only answer. They still only account for about 14% of the total generation. So if you look at what it would take to build out enough of that intermittent source to cover the nuclear plants, it's just not really feasible.
Thanks, Tim. Carrie, do you have any comment about how advanced reactors will help support the environment?
So the one nice thing with the advanced reactor community is that we are designing a solution that works well with the renewables. So it'll be hopefully a complement to the renewable sources and rather than the alternative. And as he said, you can't get there quickly with just renewables. So we hope to really supplement that.
Thank you. And Jeremy, I know that ClearPath has watched a transition and kind of how things that the Department of Energy have dialed up a little bit more in the past on energy efficiency and renewables, and now this administration is really continuing to support energy efficiency and renewables, but also dialing up the support with nuclear, and that's why we're here. What are you seeing in terms of clean energy for nuclear?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, ClearPath looks at clean energy kind of from a broader perspective, and ultimately, nuclear is appealing because it's a large generation source of emission-free electricity. And when you look at a lot of the modeling, if you believe and feel that our country and frankly the globe needs to reduce carbon emissions, all the modeling points to you cannot do it quickly and cheaply without nuclear power. It's just the fact that academic community and the data is very clear on this, and nuclear is going to play a particular role, not even in the power sector, in the industrial sector as well. The amount of heat that you can get from nuclear power generation, there's a lot of applicability for the industrial side. So the administration is wise to invest and really focus on the future of nuclear power, because it's a technology that the globe cannot live without.
Thank you. Another challenge that's often brought up when I talk about nuclear is, well, what about safety? Let's hear about safety. We've all heard, when something happens that's a problem, a challenge with nuclear, it's in the news and it's widespread. Talk about the safety enhancements that are part of the existing fleet, and then I'll ask you, Carrie, about the developing fleet. Tim?
Yeah, we've continually improved the safety performance of the nuclear plants, but if you go back to what's arguably the worst nuclear disaster, the Fukushima disaster, really the worst possible scenario, right? You melt the fuel, you breach the RPV, you breach containment. The studies that have been done show that statistically will not have any measurable effect on the health of the people in Japan. So even in a worst case scenario, certainly we never want another plant to get in that condition. But when you look at what really happened compared to its sister plant, the difference was at the sister plant, Diani, they vented containment and kept containment intact. And that was really the essential difference. So our plants were safe beforehand. That was a 9.0 earthquake that really had zero impact on the plant. It was a tsunami coming in that flooded the diesel tanks, cut off electric supply. That was the big difference. So even prior to that, but since then, the enhancements we've put in local generation that's kept somewhere near the plant but far enough away, couldn't be impacted by that type of scenario. Smaller pumps capable of pumping in that are portable to bring water to the core. They're a very safe design, and the enhancements we've put in since then make them even more safe.
Thanks, Tim. In thinking about safety, also, I think that one of the things we hear often is about radioactivity, and I heard an interesting statistic recently that your granite countertops, so a lot of people have granite countertops these days in their kitchen and bathrooms and such. The granite countertop has more radioactive elements than if you lived right next to a nuclear power plant. And so that kind of puts it in context, but I wanted to ask Carrie about the safety issues that NuScale's design brings. Some people say, Carrie, that a Fukushima wouldn't happen today with a NuScale kind of design. Can you talk about that?
Yes, and as Tim alluded to, one of the major issues that Fukushima faced was the tsunami took out the emergency diesel generators, and the traditional plants do rely on the electricity to keep pumps going, to provide cooling to the core. So what NuScale has done, we took away the need for the electricity. So in effect, when our plant loses electricity, it fails to a safe state and then cools itself passively. So that kind of accident that Fukushima experienced has just been designed out of our reactor, leading to a much safer. And then we've taken it further and looked at other issues that the existing fleet has had, and tried to remove those items, using both PRA and deterministic methods. We've eliminated a lot of the traditional design issues, and in fact, our design has no operator actions in a design basis event, which is unheard of. So we actually don't need operators to take action.
So if you think about that, and what you're saying is essentially what they call walk away safe, right?
Yep.
So that you really don't, in a situation with Fukushima where it was essentially a human error and not venting the plant, That wouldn't happen today. In addition to that, the emergency buffer zone that's now the size around a current nuclear power plant. Can you talk about what's today and what's to come in the future?
So NuScale likes to break the mold. So another thing we've been pioneering is what we call site boundary emergency planning zone. So effectively, in an accident, we have a site boundary emergency zone. Traditional plants have a 10-mile zone or even somewhere in that range. What that means then is that people don't actually receive a dose beyond the site boundary from a design accident. And therefore, we've eliminated the need to evacuate those areas. And one of the things that happened at Fukushima is people didn't actually get hurt from the reactor, but the stress of evacuation and moving elderly people did cause harm. So, it's not always the best option to evacuate in some cases. So we've eliminated that concern as well.
Thank you. So I'm kind of tackling a lot of the obstacles and hearing about the opportunities in doing that, and probably one of the very public things that's a question that comes up when you talk about nuclear is the spent fuel, Jeremy. And spent fuel in terms of nuclear waste is something that's talked about on Capitol Hill a lot. Can you talk about kind of what the path is for policy and our options in moving forward from a political standpoint?
Sure. The spent fuel debate, particularly in DC, is heated and it goes back and forth. And unfortunately, we're at a stalemate. Administration to administration, we've gone kind of back and forth on Yucca Mountain as a long-term repository. The Obama administration had kind of ended all plans to try to move forward with Yucca Mountain as a plan. The Trump administration is focused on restarting that licensing agreement, as well as trying to tackle some other options that we have moving forward. Because ultimately, if we're going to tackle the spent fuel challenges that the country faces, we need kind of all the options on the table. I think politically, as things move forward, it is going to be tough to move forward with Yucca in Nevada, given the state's opposition to it. But we've spent millions and millions of dollars trying to develop that project, and there's sound science behind the safety of it. I think that there is ample opportunity to have multiple repository sites potentially. Secretary Perry, when he was in Texas, long advocated for a repository site in West Texas, as well as an economic development opportunity. And I think there are a variety of different areas where that could be possible, as well as Yucca playing a role in the long-term storage of fuel. But on the flip side, I think there are other opportunities in the reprocessing space. You really only use 5% of the fuel that we are using in the existing fleet, and so it really presents a new fuel opportunity. And a lot of other countries around the world have utilized that to power their nuclear reactors. And frankly, the advanced reactors pose a major opportunity in the spent fuel situation. Not only can some of those reactor designs use spent fuel from the existing fleet, like Exelon's light water facilities, but also can majorly reduce waste, or some of these reactors pose little to no waste problems. So I think it's an all of the above approach, how it can be tackled, and luckily that's where the administration's focused, and hopefully we can break through some of the gridlock on Capitol Hill over it.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it's not a scientific problem with the geological repository, it is a political problem.
I would say it is a political problem, yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. And then Tim, I want to turn it over to you to talk about the reality of spent fuel and how the system of our utilities is dealing with the spent fuel from nuclear power plants today.
Sure. The first thing is we fully support getting a central repository somewhere designed. Yucca Mountain would be the obvious choice since most work's been done there. But in the interim, it's not that difficult to manage spent fuel. It only requires forced cooling for about 5 years, maybe even slightly less than that. Once that 5 years has passed, we put them in canisters, metal canisters, seal them up, put them in a concrete canister, and they're stored on a concrete pad on the site. In fact, you walk right up to them. There's no dose impact of walking right up to them. So it's very safe. It's very stable. You still have to provide, obviously, secured area around it, but it's not a difficult thing for us to manage, and the amount of nuclear fuel over a 40-year life at a nuclear power plant can be stored on an area less than a football field. So even at the full volume of the fuel being stored, it's not a difficult thing for us to manage until we get a centralized repository.
Thanks, Tim. Carrie, what about the advanced designs? How will advanced and small modular reactors manage fuel, and what will the difference of spent fuel be like?
For the new scale design, our spent fuel strategy at this time is very similar to the existing reactors, but I know a lot of the more advanced reactors, as was alluded to, would have a much smaller amount. And we have looked at strategies to shuffle it in a novel way to get more life. You indicated only about 5% of the existing energy is used. So, having multiple modules, we're looking at loading patterns that take advantage of fuel beyond, even 6 years, which is the typical amount of time it stays in there. So strategies like that to reduce the long-term amount of fuel that's generated.
So does any of the three of you want to elaborate on reprocessing and recycling of fuel, how that works, and if that's possible here in the United States?
Well, technically, certainly it's possible. In fact, there is a reprocessing facility in Joliet, or close to Joliet, Illinois, built right next to Dresden Station. The original plan was to ship the fuel to there, and General Electric would reprocess it. So technically, again, it's not difficult to do. It's a well-known technology. Again, it's a political issue. Part of the issue is, as you guys all know, some of the elements that are created when you do nuclear fusion is plutonium-239, which people want to make sure they have control over, because that's the easiest thing, to weaponize. But the other part of it is there's a transportation issue. As you're moving fuel around the country, people don't necessarily want it moved through their area. What most of them probably don't understand is they have spent nuclear fuel probably moving through their area all the time from the Navy. Navy reactors are shipped across the country constantly. So again, it's a political, it's an awareness, it's something that people don't really understand that really are the barriers to getting it done.
To Susie's point earlier, talking about nuclear power as a whole, there's just a wide array of misinformation out there about reprocessing. A lot of what I'd say non-proliferation advocates will kind of contort the facts, frankly, to scale up a safety case that frankly just isn't there. No one has deciphered a nuclear weapon from the waste of a commercial power plant before, and there's safe ways to do it, right? And countries across the world are doing. France, for example, does a lot of reprocessing. There are European nations who do this, and so it's really a missed economic development opportunity. And given that it can play a major part of the spent fuel problem, it's really a win-win. And I think ultimately it's important. I think that we can at least start with it from a military standpoint, the ability to use some of the spent fuel that we have from the naval reactors. Idaho National Lab has the capacity to do it. And frankly, as we test some of these new advanced fuels that are really needed for the future of nuclear, we'll reduce costs both for the existing fleet and for a future fleet. I think there's opportunities that reprocessing using some of that wasted energy potential can play a major part in the innovation engine for nuclear.
I think one of the things you said is really important. If somebody had the technical capability to use spent nuclear fuel for something nefarious, they wouldn't need it. They'd have a technology that they could use something else. So again,
Exactly right.
It's a very specious argument to say that that's a concern.
Okay, thank you. And what about some of the non-energy related benefits that come from nuclear technology? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, from our current plants, I think the unique thing about nuclear is it has attributes that some other types of electrical generation can have, but none of them have all of them. The first thing we talked about, reliability. Solar and wind are great environmentally, but they're intermittent and they're unpredictable. Well, the sun's predictable somewhat, but once you still want your electricity to work when the lights or when the sun goes down. So it's highly reliable. The nuclear fleet across the United States operates at about 92% capacity factor. So very, very reliable. The second thing is it provides a huge job source. A typical nuclear plant, single unit, will have about 500 people. A coal plant, about 190. And a gas plant, the new gas plants, less than 50. So it is an economic stimulation for the areas where those plants are operated. The one thing that hasn't been really brought up very much until actually this administration is the resiliency of the grid. What nuclear plants have is either 18 months or 2 years worth of fuel in the core from the time they're loaded. Doesn't rely on any trains to bring coal in, doesn't rely on a gas pipeline to bring gas to the generator. And if you want to make sure that the grid can keep operating, even if you have a disruption of gas supply or have a giant spike in gas prices or have a very cold winter, which we had a few years ago where coal piles froze, nuclear is the only thing that really combines all of those and continues to produce zero carbon electricity.
Thanks, Tim. Carrie, do you want to talk about some of the non-power generation benefits that come from advanced nuclear?
Yeah, so advanced reactors have the potential to be load following. I know originally we were discussing earlier today that the original fleet was envisioned to be load following, but due to the way that the environment's structured, that's hard. So what we've looked at with NuScale and other future reactor designs is the ability to supplement those and load follow. So instead of being just a base load source, but then in addition to that, with the small modular size, we can be put in areas that have low or no transmission infrastructure to support what we call a microgrid area. And because we have a less of a reliance on that transmission system, we actually can what's called black start grids. We have our own ability to do that, which can be really nice in areas, that have been hit by, for example, Hurricane Harvey, took out a lot of that. The nuclear fleet is supported by that, or supports the grid in those cases. Other uses of the nuclear technology, for example, are process heat. So countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, could use a nuclear process heat and reduce carbon emissions by up to 40%. A lot of the oil that they produce now is actually being burned to refine the oil into gas. So this is one area where you can use nuclear in a non-traditional way to reduce the carbon footprint. And then, of course, desalination plants. An 8-module pack that NuScale could put together would be enough power to both desalinate water and provide electricity for a town of around, or a city of around 300,000 people. So, the versatility of some of the advanced reactor designs is really nice for these non-power applications or traditional power applications.
Yeah, I'd really like to underscore the point on the flexibility of small modular reactors and some of these micro reactors that are under development, like NuScale, like Oklo. I think something that's really been in the news a lot lately, Puerto Rico, and the struggles to get the electricity system restarted there and provide power to constituents in a scenario where you would mass produce some of these modular reactors, like a NuScale small modular reactor or Oklo's micro reactor. It's something that could be deployed in a disaster situation, and unlike a lot of other electricity sources. And on the industrial point, I think one thing is, as countries are looking to address some of their industrial issues, the amount of heat that you need, and the processed heat point, to, for example, produce steel, things along those lines. Currently, right now, you have to use fossil fuels to get those type of heat rates, and so we could use these advanced reactor types for that processed heat in some of those manufacturing processes for countries that don't have access to fossil fuels, to who are reliant on foreign sources for fossil fuels, or if you wanted to eliminate some of your fossil fuel use. So I think it's appealing across the board.
Thank you. And I would also ask those of you who are here in our live audience to take a look outside as you're leaving. There's renderings of future nuclear scenarios and how these smaller, more modular reactors can have essentially no emergency barrier, and they can be put into places that we haven't been able to see in the past. So there's renderings of that were provided by Third Way, and we really appreciate having the opportunity to take a peek at what the future is going to look like for nuclear. So I want to hit 2 more quick question areas and then open it up to you for your questions here. But the economics in nuclear can be a pretty serious undertaking, and there's a lot that's been happening in the last year with production tax credits that were just recently approved on Capitol Hill. Our Loan Programs Office, the Secretary of Energy, did extend for the Vogtle plant that is the first nuclear power plant to be built in the United States in 30 years. Secretary Perry extended an additional loan program, loan guarantee, which is not just giving out money, but rather a loan from the U.S. government to get this up and running. How does the economic landscape look for nuclear when you're talking about, so a state like Indiana does not currently employ any nuclear reactors, but if they were to consider it, what are some of the benefits and coming down the pike perhaps of using nuclear?
Yeah, there's a couple. When you look at the country, there's really a bifurcation of the way nuclear is used. They're either in regulated utilities, which Indiana is all regulated utilities. That's like Southern, where they build it, it becomes part of the rate base, and it's paid for through the people that use the electricity over the life of the plant. All of our plants are what are called merchant generators, so we operate on what's really a commodity type of system. The real pressures on those plants have to do with the fact that we have to deal with what's called negative pricing. Because of some of the other credits that other types of generation get, particularly wind and solar, they'll actually sell their power at a negative price. And when they do that, the plants around there also have to get the same price. So there's a flaw in the system that is being dealt with right now at the urging of the Department of Energy through the people that operate the grids. That'll go a long way for helping the merchant fleets stay viable. So from that standpoint, you kind of have to look, there's two different business models. For a state like Indiana, you know, if you would ever build a nuclear plant here, you get the jobs that come along with it. You get highly reliable electricity for long term. I talked earlier about the 40 years of life. There's no reason that these plants go much longer. All of our fleet has been extended by 20 years already and could go further than that. So, the benefits from we've talked a lot about the environmental benefits, talked about the economic benefits to the towns that are around there, and the long-term stability of the grid and the operating system are really, I think, the big benefits that the existing fleet brings.
Anyone have anything to add to that?
I will add, with the advanced reactors, specifically the modular, one of the aspects that we're looking at is the modularization bringing down the overall construction costs, because I know a lot of what people look at is, look how expensive these are to build, but when you can factory produce them in a larger quantity, that helps bring the cost overall down. And with the option to add modules over time, in our design it's up to 12. If a utility only needed 6 to begin with, they could start with 6, and if later their energy demands increased, they could opt to add additional reactors at that time. So it allows a little flexibility in the initial investment model.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I would just say this is kind of exactly the point of why at ClearPath we're really excited about these advanced reactor types, reducing costs from mass production. Just sheer applicability. They're inherently not going to be big multi-billion-dollar projects necessarily as you build smaller reactors, smaller footprints, so they can be put in different places. And so I think, especially as you look at the longer view of the needs of the grid in the long term and factoring in those resiliency and reliability components, it's going to make a lot of sense to have a diverse fuel supply and have a nuclear a part of that as a base load clean resource.
Thank you. So my final question is about jobs. I'm sure most of the people in this room want to know about jobs in nuclear, and I can tell you from our administration's point of view that nuclear is a major focus from a lot of different points of view. The government would like to see the United States really get back in the game in terms of civil nuclear energy and technology. And so just seeing our panel here, it gives you a perspective. Jeremy works in policy, and he's working in nuclear. Carrie works in regulatory certification and is an engineer. Tim works in operations for the existing fleet. And so these are 3 very different job titles. And so my question is, from the 3 different worlds you live in, tell us about the different kinds of jobs that are available that people in this room might find interesting in the future.
Well, from my perspective, probably my favorite job, other than the one I have now, of course, was as a control room supervisor. I was licensed to operate the plant, was in the control room for 8 hours a day, supervising the operation. I was a senior reactor operator. But really, once you get in, you can do anything. I was a maintenance director for 2.5 years. I was the work management director for a year. I hadn't been in engineering actually in 18 years when I became the engineering director at Dresden Station. And it's not just the plants. You know, we have the fuel fabricators that provide jobs. We have the safety analysis people. I worked for about a year or 2 years in our public policy group because they need some technical expertise in those areas too. So, you know, once you get in, the other thing I'd tell you, we look at our demographics very closely. And just when most of the plants were built and when a lot of the hiring was done, we'll have about a 30% attrition rate over the next 3 years. So there are opportunities even within the existing fleet, I think, for people that are currently interested in that. And hopefully, you know, as the advanced reactors come online, that'll continue. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Thanks. Carrie?
So I would second that. One thing I've always loved about this industry is the diverse options that are available once you're in it. When I was in school, I don't think I recognized just how many opportunities I would have for development once I hit the industry. In NuScale specifically, you know, you obviously have the nuclear engineering group, the design group, but there's a large contingent of electrical, civil, mechanical engineers, because there are components that need to be designed. So it goes beyond just the strict, nuclear engineering that, at least in my perspective, I came with. But also, you know, we have a large group for human factors engineering. One of our big items is, you know, if we have 12 modules to operate in a traditional plant, there's a regulatory requirement for the number of operators you have. If you apply that times 12 plants, that's a lot of operators, a lot of overhead, you know, going back to the economics. So we spend a lot of time and effort looking at human factors and how can we design a control room that eliminates the need for that many operators. So there's a lot of opportunities that you may not even realize are traditionally nuclear engineering related. And for, you know, NuScale specifically, about 40% of our staff is under 40, so it's actually a really young environment compared to the traditional nuclear environment that I came from. But that's not to say that we don't have older people that we, older.
Sorry.
Who are you talking to?
I realized when I looked at you.
Sorry, I get that all the time.
We do like to leverage the experience of individuals that have, you know, been around. Yeah.
Seasoned people. We get it. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say in the public policy space, there's a lot of opportunities as well. And frankly, there's a major need for folks with technical expertise. This isn't, I worked in Congress, this isn't a knock on congressional leaders or policymakers, but they don't know anything about nuclear engineering. And so when we're talking about the regulatory process, about research and development, when we're talking about what is needed to really advance these technologies, you need that technical backing. Often at ClearPath, when we're going in, you know, I come at it from a policy perspective, but I need those people with the scientific and engineering backgrounds because there is a lot of misinformation out there, and it's important to have that kind of bedrock of technical and scientific expertise so you can push back on some of the inaccurate information that gets thrown out there and really just underscore the benefits of this technology.
Okay, great. So I'd like to turn it over to the folks here in the room. What questions do you have? And I think we have a few microphones that we can pass up. We have a gentleman here in the...
I can just speak loudly. So going back to safety, I know in 2014 there was a Belgian sabotage attempt, and so I was interested how you guys felt about our fleet and the future fleet as far as sabotage goes, what risk there is, and then an add-on question as far as cyber. Does that add more sabotage risk or just more risk?
Let's restate the question if we could, because he didn't have a microphone. So just to make sure that everybody online can hear, the question was about...
Sure. So I just asked about what's the sabotage risk of our current fleet and the future fleet, and does cyber exacerbate that problem or not?
So with the current fleet, I'd say the risk is very low. To get badged at a nuclear power plant unescorted as access, you actually have to go through a very in-depth personality inventory to make sure that you wouldn't attempt that kind of thing. They actually do financial checks on people to make sure that you couldn't somehow be blackmailed into doing. So the security checks for people getting badged at a nuclear power plant with unescorted access is to the point I think the likelihood of sabotage is very, very low. In addition to that, just the natural redundancy of those plants, it would be very difficult for somebody to sabotage anything that would lead to any sort of an issue before it was detected. They'd have to damage multiple pieces of equipment to actually cause anything to happen. So they're all built to be what's considered to be fail-safe. It's really kind of a miracle they operate as well as they do, because there's so many things that can shut down a reactor. So I think that's low. Cyber, we have very strict cyber rules at the nuclear power plants. You can't even put a thumb drive in anything at the nuclear power plant without taking it to what we call a kiosk, plugging it in, and it does a virus scan to make sure nothing gets loaded. There are what are called data diodes that are installed so that information may be able to get out of systems that are controlled digitally, but nothing can get back in. So we were kind of at the forefront of cybersecurity, and so I think all of those things together make the likelihood of any type of a sabotage or any type of even cyber sabotage very, very low. The other thing is, with the older fleet, the safety systems are all analog. It makes it very, make it really impossible to do anything cyber. A lot of the secondary plant, the turbine controls, have been turned to digital, but the safety systems are all generally the original systems. So I think all those things together make the likelihood of anything happening very small.
Thank you.
I would also add to that, you didn't mention the security force that is on every existing site.
And that's how I've explained it before. That's a good prompt. That cybersecurity and security at the plant, they're both really the same thing. To do anything from a cyber standpoint, you have to be inside the fence. And if you've ever been to an operating nuclear power plant, they are the most well-defended places in the United States. I mean, we have security officers up in towers with weapons. We have patrols all over the place. We have a very detailed response plan. So, from an internal sabotage standpoint, we go through all the background checks. From an external, we actually get tested every so often, where a team of ex-SEALs come in and try to break into the plant. And we have to defend them, not knowing when they're going to show up. And so physical security at those plants is much higher than any other place, I think, in the country.
Any other questions? This is your chance. We have the experts here. Yes, sir. I think Anna has here we go.
Thank you, Robert. So speaking on the spent fuel, you said it's not really a technical problem, but is there any what's the financial impact of using or storing the spent fuel?
So the actual financial impact to us is zero. The way this all works out is actually the Department of Energy was required to pick up the fuel in 1998. Was when they were supposed to start picking up the fuel and taking it to permanent storage. Since they couldn't do that, because that's what the original fuel pools were designed for, since they weren't able to do that, we have settlements with the Department of Energy that they reimburse us for the costs of putting the fuel in dry casks and storing it. So there is a financial impact. It just is through the DOE funding of that.
Which essentially goes back to the taxpayer.
Right.
And so for all that time that the spent fuel hasn't been picked up, the cumulative cost is over $35 billion to the taxpayer. So it is quite an expensive proposition to not comply with the law and go around and pick up that spent fuel. Good question. Yes, sir.
In the news over the last couple of weeks has been Saudi Arabia's interest in pursuing a nuclear program, and in the last couple of days I've seen some articles suggesting that there may be some proliferation concerns. Saudi Arabia is looking to perform its own enrichment and has expressed interest in potentially acquiring nuclear weapons. So can anybody here speak to that at all?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about it. So Saudi Arabia essentially has a long-term 2050 goal of deploying 17 gigawatts of nuclear power to power the country. It's part of their clean energy strategy. And so the Department of Energy, Secretary Perry, this administration is in the process of potentially negotiating what's called a 1-2-3 agreement with them, which would basically allow the U.S. to be a partner in that and export U.S. technologies. Couple things, we talked a little bit about proliferation risks previously, and I think one thing that I would underscore is Saudi Arabia is moving forward with this. If it's not with the U.S., it's going to be with China, Russia, or Korea. So I think I would rather have the United States at the table there, one from an economic development standpoint, and two from a security standpoint, because we want to be that partner as a world hegemon in place and working. So I think it makes a lot of sense from a national security standpoint for the U.S. to be the partner with the Saudis. And two, I think as you look over Iran, nuclear power is going to play a significant role in the global power transformation over the next 30 years. And so I think it would be, I think it's wise for the U.S. to be a bigger player in that and not cede that to other geopolitical leaders like Russia, China, or the Koreans, frankly.
Okay, why don't we take some questions? Any questions that came in online, Sean? We've got 2 questions online, and then we'll finish up with anybody here in person that has a follow-up question. And our panelists have agreed to stay a few minutes afterwards if you want to come up and have a conversation. Go ahead, Sean.
David has asked, are you researching possibilities with thorium reactors? And if so, what waste from those reactors, what waste would come from those reactors?
I caught this one word. What type of reactor? Oh,
Thorium.
Thorium.
Certainly from us, we're not a research company, so we are not.
And NuScale is a light water reactor design, but there are companies out there in the industry that are doing thorium reactors. I can't think of the specific and names off the top of my head now that I forgot. Do you?
I don't off the top of my head, but there are a variety of companies out there who are doing research and development, and a lot of academic institutions focused on it as well.
And then, sorry.
Go ahead.
And then Mike asked, in addition to SMRs, are there other advanced reactors the industry is looking at?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of interest. I was just thinking of the statistic I saw. I think was at the NRC's Regulatory Information Conference last week in DC, which is a very large conference, and attended a session on advanced reactors. I think they mentioned there were something like 30 companies currently pursuing advanced reactor designs, in addition to a couple companies doing small modular light water reactors. There's the molten salt reactors. And I think I've seen designs for integral molten salt reactors, so it's more of like what I would call a battery pack. So there's a variety of companies out there, in addition to NuScale, that are going forward and trying to pioneer nuclear technology, and we're trying to help them by blazing the path for them.
Yeah, you can't. We work very closely with a lot of these advanced reactor companies to try to essentially ensure that there is both a regulatory and a financial environment that they could ultimately succeed in. A lot of really innovative stuff, ranging, and she's exactly right. NuScale is kind of paving the way, particularly from the regulatory standpoint. So NuScale is going through that NRC process, and actually this year the administration requested for the first time resources to begin the licensing process for Oklo, which is a micro reactor, a fast reactor. Moving forward, there's a bunch of high temperature gas reactors, sodium lead cooled reactors, molten salt, a lot of interesting designs out there. I think 30 to 50 just in North America under development, and a lot of them are, in particular, are exciting because they have a lot of different use cases. So I don't think any of those reactor designs are mutually exclusive. I think a lot of them are going to play, and which is why I think it's really exciting that you guys are in this field. There is a lot of cool stuff going on that is ready to take off in the next decade, essentially. And so you're getting in the industry right at the right time, where there's cutting edge technologies, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities.
Thanks, Jeremy. I just also wanted to reiterate that something that's very interesting about a lot of these new advanced reactor companies is that Some of them do come to the U.S. government for funding, but there are a lot that are not coming to the government for funding, that are coming to the government for other kinds of support. But there are a lot of private investors being driven by the opportunity for clean energy, emission-free technology for power generation, like Bill Gates at TerraPower and others who are just advancing technology and nuclear because it's the right thing to do and it's the right thing for the environment. So we're seeing a lot of these emerging companies working on advanced designs who are not looking for the government to fund their projects. So I think that that's an encouraging sign as well. All right, well, we're going to wrap up our questions here unless anybody else has any more. Yes, we have two here in the audience.
So would you agree that the Trump administration is generally against more regulation?
Yes.
Okay. But we've also stated that conventional nuclear power plants are relying on regulated energy markets and not the deregulated ones.
That's a really good question.
Can you reconcile those two, maybe that contradiction?
Yes, that's a really good question. And the question is basically, Secretary Perry had put out a notice of proposed rule change to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission last fall. And the question is about additional regulation on the markets and trying to encourage more use of nuclear technology because of the resiliency that we talked about. And so from the administration's point of view, the markets are not working as they should. And they are already very much manipulated through subsidies on them. And so in an effort to try to encourage the use of technology, the Secretary of Energy did issue the notice of proposed rule change. Working in a merchant market, you might have something to add to that, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I could spend a lot of time talking about the markets and how the markets are not functioning correctly in the regulated or the merchant market. But essentially what you got to look at it is if electricity is truly a commodity, then no form of electricity should be more highly valued than any other. Well, what we've done through subsidies in the past, we valued wind and solar well above nuclear, even though they share a lot of the same attributes. That has driven the market to, in a skewed manner. It has distorted the market, and you can't get good price formation. If you're going to do that, we had fought for years to eliminate the production tax credit for years, even though we were the 5th largest wind company in the United States, to the point where we actually got kicked out of the wind lobbying group. If you don't, once you subsidize one thing, then it automatically is giving a benefit to that. So what we have done through Illinois and New York, locally they have recognized the value of zero carbon electricity and essentially provided that to the plants that were no longer economically viable to keep those nuclear plants running. So in a regulated market, it's all in the rate base. That's up to the local authorities. That's up to the local public service commission or public utility commission. And I don't think at least not that I've heard the administration, that order in fact exempted those that were covered under that were part of a regulated utility. So it would have only affected merchant plants.
Yeah, there's kind of two different types of regulation here. So in the regulation and what the Trump administration is trying to streamline is what it takes to build a project. So the regulation on licensing a project, going through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, getting the permits and things that you need to build a plant. So we want to make that easier. You need to go through a process to ensure you're building something right. But we need to cut a lot of red tape there because that is one of the major overheads for the existing fleet and a challenge to building new plants is some unnecessary regulations that purely increase operating costs with really no value. And so it's really important to reduce those type of regulations. When you're talking about electricity markets and regulated markets versus the wholesale electricity markets, we're really more talking about how electricity is sold and distributed in your particular region. So I'll use Georgia, for example, and Southern's the big utility, and Southern is a regulated market. And so when you build a project, Southern Company has to go to a state public utility commission, propose it, it goes into the rate base. Exelon functions a lot in the wholesale electricity markets and in what's called PJM in their particular region. And there are multiple other regions around the country where they have decided to not go through that state process of doing it, and you kind of bid in and work in an electricity market that's more regional. Is that a fair way, or an oversimplified way of describing it?
Yeah, the
Great
utilities,
question.
so the wires companies don't own the generation. You buy your generation from whoever gives you the lowest bid.
Exactly.
Did we have a question over here? Yes, sir. Can we get him the microphone?
Okay, so this is a question about non-proliferation. So there have been concerns, I think, particularly in recent years, about some states that have had more subversive intentions with their nuclear energy programs, where they've been trying to use them. Well, they've used them or tried to use them to develop, clandestine weapons programs. We've seen it with the DPRK, for example. I know there were concerns about Iran, and I think if I'm not mistaken, the Trump administration was talking about maybe even not recertifying them for the Iran deal that was signed under the Obama administration. And so I suppose to that end, do you think that the international community or the United States needs to do more in terms of policy or regulation or monitoring of other states to try to advocate for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons?
It's a great question.
So I will fully admit the proliferation policies is not my forte. But what I do know in the department, yes, I would say that the international community does need to do more. And I think the problem and where we've had issues around the situations you described is where a government actor doesn't work in good faith within that international community. And so that's where I think there is a real distinction when we're talking about, for example, a 1-2-3 agreement with a country, or for example, UAE is partnering with Korea to build 4 new nuclear reactors. UAE is a good partner in the global environment and works within the international community, and there are structures in place to do monitoring and make sure that things are functioning. And I think the U.S. needs to play a major role in that, and I think that is why Secretary Perry has been so much out front in this kind of vision of why we should play a part in Saudi Arabia's nuclear future, because it's important for the U.S. As a major leader in the world to be involved in the future of that, because countries want to take their energy future into their own hands, and so we need to make sure that folks are doing that right.
Okay, any other questions before we wrap up? Yes, Anna.
What advice would you all have for young people who want to get involved and want to contribute to this?
Great question, thank you.
I missed the very end.
What advice would you give young people who want to get involved and want to contribute?
We have NAYGN is the organization that most of our younger employees belong to that supports nuclear power. They do a great deal, but the biggest thing I think is make sure people get the true story. That's the biggest issue I think that drives people's opinion of nuclear power the wrong way, is they don't understand it. And they believe a lot of things that they hear that are not true. And it's been going on for a long time. It's tough to overcome. So when you hear people talking about it, I think the most important thing is make sure they get the right information. And there's enough examples, I think, out there that we can use. Talk just environmentally. Anybody that says they're for clean energy but doesn't support nuclear power only has 2 good examples. One is Germany and one is California. Germany shut down their nuclear power plants. We're going to have told, it's supposed to be fully renewable. What's happened there is they actually produce a lot more carbon, and what they burn is lignite coal, which is about the dirtiest coal that you can burn. They didn't think far enough ahead. Their carbon footprint has gone up. The price of electricity has gone up over 150%. So they didn't think through the policy. In California, there's so much solar they built out so quickly. When the sun goes down, they start up diesel generators to provide electricity so they don't get a voltage collapse. So, when people talk about nuclear not being essential to a clean environment, I think you just need to put the facts out. And there's enough examples where good intentions ended up in poor policy, which ended up in bad results.
And I would just add, stay in touch with us. Keep in touch with the organizations that you see here. Look them up, follow their Facebook, follow our Facebook at the U.S. Department of Energy. You can go to Energy Government Nuclear and find us there, the Office of Nuclear Energy, as well as our Twitter page. And stay involved and talk about it. Start a conversation. Let people know what you've learned and what you know, and hear what their questions are. So I would just say, keep asking questions, keep talking about it, and the people in this room and the people who are watching online are our biggest advocates. And so when someone has a question, let's answer it and let them make the decision so that the decision is at least fact-based and they have the right information to make the right answers. So thank you very much. This concludes our evening for tonight. I want to thank Nathan Boyle, who put this together. I want to thank Dr. Kim, who's hosting us, and thank all of our special guests here tonight.